Have you ever felt unseen? Like no one truly understands you? Like your struggles go completely unnoticed? Maybe you've prayed to God, but you wonder if God is actually really listening. If that's you, then today's message is for you. Today, we're looking at one of the most powerful stories in the Gospels, Jesus healing the blind man. It's a story about healing, but more than that, it's about a God who sees you when no one else does. You know what the problem is today? There are so many people who feel the pain of being overlooked. You know, I personally have seen them everywhere I go. In every major city that I have visited, I see some men, women, even children at times, sitting by the roadside begging as people walk by without any notice and or intentionally ignoring them. We see the same thing in John chapter 9, verse 1. We meet a man who has been born blind, and in that culture, blindness wasn't just a disability, it was actually a sentence to a life of begging, a life of being ignored. And in that society, being blind oftentimes was seen as sin. Now, people saw him, but they didn't really see him. Alone and in despair, day in and day out, he lived completely ignored and shut out of society. His family left him to survive on his own. Even the disciples, when they looked at him, they didn't ask, "How can we help?" Instead, they asked Jesus, "Lord, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" We see this in John chapter 9, verse 2. Now, the disciples assumed that this man's suffering was a punishment. But you know, Jesus saw something different. How did Jesus respond? Here we see the true nature of God. Jesus saw beyond the surface. He looked inside that blind man and he knelt down beside him. You can imagine it. He placed his hands on his shoulder. He looked at the disciples, and here's how he answered. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. John chapter 9, verse 3. Jesus didn't see a mistake. He saw an opportunity for God's glory. Well, then Jesus does something completely unusual. He spits on the ground, he makes mud, and then he takes it and he puts it on the man's eyes. Why? Jesus could have just healed him instantly at that moment, but he chose a process. You know, sometimes healing doesn't come the way we expect. Sometimes God allows a process, because through that process, he's not just healing your body or your circumstances, but he's healing your faith. Sometimes requires an act of obedience. Sometimes true healing requires that we walk by faith, not by sight. Now, the blind man had to do this too. You know, every day he felt he had to feel his way towards the pool of Siloam. He was hoping for a miracle. And at this moment, Jesus tells him, "Go wash the mud out of your eyes at the pool of Siloam." Now, this man, still blind, had a choice. He could either stay where he was or take a step of faith. You know, he didn't receive his sight instantly. He had to act on Jesus's words before he saw the results. How many of us are waiting for God to show us something before we obey? We're looking for clues and signs when he's actually asking us to take a step of faith first. When we take that first step and do what God asks of us, then a miracle can happen, a new vision, a new life, and that is on its way. Well, the blind man arrived at the pool of Siloam. You can almost imagine him walking through the streets with that mud pie on his eyes. And he began to wash his eyes just as Jesus told him to do. And suddenly, he looked around in amazement, and for the first time in his life, he begins to see colors. And he sees for the very first time. He obeyed, and a miracle happened. Now, he came back seeing. Now, the same people who ignored him before were now asking, "Who is this man who used to sit and beg?" We read this in John chapter 9, verse 8. They couldn't believe it. His life was transformed, not just physically, but spiritually. Now, later on in the chapter, Jesus reveals himself to the man. And at that moment, he believes. His healing wasn't just about sight. It was really about salvation. What is the application for you and I today? What does all of this mean for you and me? 1, God sees you when others don't. You may feel overlooked, but you are never forgotten by God. 2, your struggles are not a punishment. They have a purpose. Jesus said this man's blindness was so that God's work could be displayed. What if your pain is actually setting the stage for a testimony? 3, obedience comes before the miracle. Are you willing to trust God even before you see the results? 4, healing isn't just about circumstances. It's about relationship. The greatest miracle wasn't just that the man could see, but that he met Jesus. For you, God who sees you, Jesus sees what no one else does. He sees your pain. He hears your prayers. He knows your hopes and he knows your hearts. And he is working in ways that you cannot see. Maybe today he's asking you to take a step of faith. Even before you have all the answers, will you trust him? Friends, Jesus sees you. Take the step towards him.